You need to watch this if you crave chills down your spine. Welcome to Soul Studios. Here, true crime meets the unknown. Suspense lurks in every shadow and supernatural forces whisper from the dark. We craft chilling, edge-of-your-seat short stories inspired by the eerie, the unexplained, and the most haunting mysteries. 3 new stories drop every week, each one darker than the last. Are you ready to step inside? Subscribe now before the next story finds you.
Some people fear the dark, but Sebastián Vélez has learned that the dark is never truly empty. From the moment he took his first breath, something watched him. Something ancient, something unseen. Born under a storm that shook the mountains of Puerto Rico, he came into this world in silence, his eyes wide open, as if he was already seeing beyond the veil of the living. A gift, a curse, a fate he never asked for. The dead call to him. They whisper in the shadows, press against his skin in the dead of night, their cold breath curling at his ear. He doesn't just see ghosts, he feels them, hears their secrets, knows the truths they died with. At first, the villagers only whispered about the strange boy who spoke to empty rooms, but when the things he saw started to come true, the missing found in shallow graves, the doomed warned too late, fear took root. They began to call him something else. El Niño de los Muertos, the boy of the dead. But Sebastián has learned that knowing too much is a dangerous thing. The dead do not always want to be found. Some secrets should remain buried, and some spirits refuse to let go. A haunted mailman who walks long after his death. A crying child locked away in a forgotten room. A landslide he saw before it happened, swallowing hundreds in the night. And the one thing that watches him still, the thing that does not whisper, does not move, but waits. For years, Sebastián has lived in the space between the living and the dead, trying to outrun the weight of his gift. But the dead don't rest, and the more he tries to ignore them, the louder they call. Some fear the dark, but the dark fears him. Subscribe now, because once you hear the whispers, you can never unhear them. Chapter 1. The Birth of Sight. The night Sebastián Vélez was born, a storm rolled over the mountains of Puerto Rico with a fury that shook the earth. Rain lashed against the rooftops of Utuado, drumming a frantic rhythm that matched the cries of his laboring mother. Wind howled through the valleys, rattling the wooden shutters, forcing its way into the cracks of the modest home where Rosa Vélez writhed in pain on a straw-stuffed mattress. The scent of damp earth, burning candles and herbal remedies thickened the air, mingling with the salt of her sweat. Doña Elena, the village midwife, hovered beside her, muttering incantations under her breath. The flickering candlelight cast jagged shadows on the walls, shifting like restless spirits. She dipped her fingers into a bowl of warm water infused with sage and rue, anointing Rosa's forehead with the sacred mixture. El niño viene con un don, y una maldición, the old woman murmured, her clouded eyes unreadable. A gust of wind rattled the door. The candle flames shuddered, nearly extinguished. Rosa sobbed, gripping the bedsheets as another wave of pain crashed through her. She barely heard the midwife's words, but the warning nestled in the room like a living thing, whispering through the rafters. When Sebastián entered the world, he did not cry. He did not wail like other newborns. He emerged silent, eyes wide open, unblinking. He stared up at the ceiling as if already seeing something beyond the veil of reality, something no one else could perceive. Doña Elena hesitated before cutting the umbilical cord, her weathered hands trembling. Dios nos proteja, she whispered. But there was no stopping fate. As Sebastián grew, Rosa noticed the strangeness in her son. His gaze lingered on empty corners of the room, his small hands reaching for something unseen. He babbled in the language of infants, but sometimes it seemed as if he were responding, laughing, cooing, or nodding as if another presence shared the space with him. She would catch him staring out the window at nothing, his dark eyes wide and unblinking. Then suddenly, he would turn and say something in his small, solemn voice. La señora está en la cocina. Rosa would whirl around, her heart pounding, but the kitchen was empty. By the time he was 5, the occurrences had only intensified. One morning, as Rosa prepared breakfast, Sebastián sat at the wooden table, swinging his small legs. His fingers traced idle patterns on the surface, his expression distant. "They're coming," he said suddenly. Rosa turned from the stove, her grip tightening on the wooden spoon. "Quien, mi amor?" He looked up at her, blinking as if surprised she didn't already know. "Tia Marta y los primos." Rosa frowned. Her sister lived in Ponce, nearly 2 hours away, and she hadn't mentioned visiting. Still, an unease settled in her stomach. An hour later, there was a knock on the door. When she opened it, there stood Marta, rain-drenched and smiling sheepishly. "I should have called, but the boys were restless, and I thought—" Rosa barely heard the rest. She turned back to look at Sebastián, who simply sat at the table, eating his pan de agua as if nothing had happened. After that, the villagers began to talk. They whispered about the Vélez boy, about his eerie knowing, about the way he sometimes stopped mid-play to stare at something only he could see. The children, once his friends, now avoided him. They called him El Niño de los Muertos, the boy of the dead. They ran from him, afraid of what he might see, what he might say. At night, the shadows seemed to stretch longer in their home. Rosa often found Sebastián awake, sitting upright in bed, his small frame trembling. "What is it, my amor?" she would whisper, smoothing back his dark curls. "The shadows," he would say, voice small. "They stand over me." Rosa felt a chill seep into her bones. She sought help from the village priest, Padre Ignacio. He listened to her concerns, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Some children are more sensitive," he said carefully. "It is not necessarily evil, but it is dangerous if not understood." He gave her a small bottle of holy water and told her to pray. That night, as she sprinkled the water around Sebastián's room, the air grew thick and heavy, like the hush before a storm. The candle on his nightstand flickered wildly. Then, just as suddenly, the pressure lifted. Sebastián sighed in his sleep, turning onto his side. For a few nights, he did not wake screaming, but peace never lasted long. By the time Sebastián was 8, he had learned to keep quiet about the things he saw. The whispers in the village had turned to outright fear, and even the adults watched him with wary eyes. One evening, as he and his mother walked home from the market, they passed Doña Josefina's house. The old woman sat on her porch, her hands gnarled with age, knitting by the fading light. Sebastián stopped. He tilted his head, his brows drawing together. Rosa tugged his hand. "Vamos, it's getting dark." Sebastián didn't move. "She won't be here tomorrow." Rosa's blood ran cold. The next morning, the church bells rang. Doña Josefina had passed in her sleep. After that, even Rosa could no longer deny what she had feared for years. Her son was different. Her mother, Sebastián's abuela, crossed herself when she visited. She gripped his small face in her hands, searching his dark eyes for answers. "Brujo," she whispered when she thought he wasn't listening. But Sebastián always listened. And deep down, he knew she wasn't wrong. As the years passed, the weight of his gift or curse only grew heavier. He stopped telling people what he saw, stopped acknowledging the flickering figures at the edges of his vision. But they never left him. They lingered in the shadows, in the spaces between the living and the dead. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he would wake to the sound of whispering, to the icy breath of something unseen brushing against his skin, and always, always he felt them watching. Chapter 2, The Mailman. At 13, Sebastián sat on the front porch, his bare feet pressed against the sun-warmed concrete steps. He picked absently at the peeling paint on the wooden railing, his fingertips tracing the rough, splintering surface. The air was thick with humidity, the scent of ripe mangoes and damp earth settling deep into his lungs. From the kitchen window behind him, he could hear the soft clatter of dishes, his mother humming an old folk song as she washed up from lunch. A fly buzzed near his ear, landing briefly on his arm before he flicked it away. The afternoon was slow, the kind that seemed to stretch endlessly, heavy and drowsy. A slight breeze stirred the leaves of the ceiba tree in the yard, carrying with it the faint aroma of grilled meat from a neighbor's backyard. Then he heard it. Tap, tap, tap. Footsteps against the cracked pavement of the street, rhythmic, steady. His gaze lifted. The mailman was passing by. Sebastián's stomach clenched, a deep and instinctive unease curling inside him. Something wasn't right. At first glance, the man looked ordinary enough, dressed in his usual navy blue uniform, the canvas satchel slung over his shoulder. But as Sebastián's eyes lingered, the details twisted, distorted. The uniform was wrinkled, the fabric slightly askew as if it had been slept in. His skin was pale, too pale, like milk left out in the sun, drained of warmth. And then there were his eyes, dark hollows, not just tired, not just shadowed, empty. Sebastián swallowed hard. The mailman didn't stop at any of the houses. He didn't glance up at the windows where curtains stirred with curious eyes peeking out. He didn't acknowledge Sebastián sitting there on the porch. He just kept moving. Sebastián's fingers curled against the step beneath him. Then the mailman turned the corner at the end of the street. Sebastián's breath hitched. A chill skittered down his spine despite the stifling heat of the day. His feet moved before his mind could stop them. He pushed himself up, bolting down the steps, his sneakers slapping against the pavement as he took off in a sprint. The humid air clung to his skin, thick and suffocating. His heartbeat pounded against his ribs, his pulse a frantic drumbeat in his ears. He rounded the corner, and the world shifted. The truth hit him like a wave of ice. The mailman wasn't walking, he was floating. His feet never touched the ground. Sebastián skidded to a halt, nearly stumbling over his own feet. His breath came in short, sharp gasps, his body screaming at him to turn around, to run. But he couldn't move. He was frozen, watching. The mailman glided forward, weightless, moving with eerie precision. The satchel at his side didn't bounce with his steps, because there were no steps. His body was rigid, his arms locked at his sides. The world around him felt wrong, warped. The birds in the trees had gone silent. The rustling leaves were still. The air pressed down on Sebastián thick as syrup, muffling every sound except the distant, unnatural tap, tap, tap of non-existent footsteps. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, the mailman was gone. He didn't fade. He didn't dissolve. He was simply no longer there. Sebastián stood there, his limbs trembling, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. His mouth was dry. The taste of fear lingered on his tongue, bitter, metallic. It was only when the sound of a dog barking in the distance shattered the silence that he stumbled backward, turned on his heel and ran. That night, Sebastián lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling. The shadows cast by the street lamp outside his window stretched and twisted across his room, shifting with each passing moment. The hum of cicadas filled the air, a steady, droning chorus. He couldn't shake the image of the mailman, the way he moved, the way his eyes had been nothing but hollows. He told himself he had imagined it, that it was the heat playing tricks on him, that it was just the way the light had hit, distorting things. But deep down, he knew better. The next morning, the news spread like wildfire. His mother had the radio on as she cooked breakfast, the scent of frying eggs and coffee filling the house. Sebastián sat at the table, picking at his toast, his stomach too unsettled to eat. Then he heard the words. Tragic accident last night. Mailman struck by a vehicle, died instantly. The fork slipped from his fingers, clattering onto his plate. His mother turned, frowning. Sebastián? He didn't answer. His mind was racing, heart hammering against his ribs. The mailman had died last night, but Sebastián had seen him walking long after his heart had stopped beating. His mother was still watching him, concern etched into her face. Mijo, are you okay? He forced a nod. Yeah, just not hungry. She sighed, brushing his hair back from his forehead. You need to eat something. But he couldn't, because he knew. What he had seen was real. And if the dead could walk the streets of his town, what else was out there, lurking just beyond what people were willing to see? Chapter 3. The Shadow Watcher. At 16, Sebastián had long since stopped being afraid. There was no point in fear. It didn't protect him, didn't change anything. The ghosts came whether he feared them or not. The whispers found him in the night, the warnings curled around his ears like mist. They had always been there, waiting in the corners of his life, watching from just beyond the light. He had learned to live with them, but this was different. The night was warm, suffocatingly so. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and overripe fruit from the small market stalls that had closed hours ago. The pavement was still warm beneath his feet, radiating the heat it had absorbed all day. His shirt clung to his back, damp with sweat, but despite the humidity, a cold prickle crawled up his spine. A weight pressed against him, unseen but undeniable. He was being watched. His pulse remained steady, his face calm, but his muscles coiled, every instinct in his body bracing for something unseen. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his head. At first he saw nothing. The street stretched behind him, empty. The yellow glow of the streetlights flickered weakly, casting long shadows against the cracked pavement. The houses were silent, their windows dark. And then he saw it, a shadow, not like the others. This one was wrong. It was impossibly tall, stretching as high as the streetlight, its edges shifting as though it were made of smoke but never dispersing. It had no face, no eyes, yet Sebastián felt its gaze pressing against his skin. The darkness around it seemed heavier, denser, swallowing the dim light. A deep, crawling silence filled the space between them. Sebastián exhaled slowly. He didn't run. He didn't scream. He simply turned back around and kept walking. The shadow did not follow. It did not vanish. It only watched. Footsteps in the dark. The sensation of being observed didn't fade, even as he moved farther away. It clung to him, a weight at the nape of his neck, a pressure against his ribs. His mouth tasted of copper, as though the air itself carried the tang of blood. He adjusted the strap of his bag, keeping his steps even. Running wouldn't help. He knew that much. The streets were quiet, but not in the way they usually were at night. It wasn't the peaceful stillness of a town winding down. It was something else, something unnatural. The usual sounds, distant music, the rustle of leaves, the occasional bark of a stray dog, were gone. Silence, except found. At first it was so soft he almost missed it. A shuffle. Not quite footsteps, but something close. His fingers curled into a fist. Another shuffle. Closer. Sebastián clenched his jaw. His breath came slow and measured, but his muscles were tense. Every nerve alight with the awareness that whatever was behind him wasn't human. One more block. The noise came again. A low, dragging sound like something heavy being pulled across the pavement. Then a breath. Right behind him. Warm, damp, wrong. His stomach clenched. "Leave me alone," he muttered under his breath, barely more than a whisper. Silence. Then a sound. Not words, not a whisper. A resonance. Low, vibrating through his bones, pressing against his skull like the air itself had turned to stone. His vision blurred for a fraction of a second. A pressure built behind his eyes, making his head ache. The street lamp ahead flickered violently, casting erratic, twisting shadows that slithered across the pavement. And then the weight lifted. The air lightened. The presence was gone. Sebastián exhaled sharply. His shoulders ached from the tension, his jaw tight enough to make his teeth hurt. But he didn't look back. He didn't need to. Marked. By the time he reached his house, his skin was slick with sweat, but his hands were ice cold. The door creaked softly as he stepped inside. The scent of burning wax and incense wrapped around him like a shroud. His mother sat at the kitchen table, a candle flickering beside her. The wax had pooled at its base, hardened into uneven rivers. She was rubbing the beads of her rosary between her fingers, her lips moving in silent prayer. Her gaze snapped to him the moment he entered. Her expression tightened. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sebastián hesitated before answering. Saw what? What exactly had he seen? He shrugged off his jacket. The fabric clung to his skin, damp and uncomfortable. "I don't know what you're talking about." His mother inhaled sharply, setting the rosary down. The beads rattled softly against the wooden table. "Come here." Sebastián's muscles tensed, but he stepped forward. She reached for his arm, her touch firm but gentle as she turned his wrist over. His stomach dropped, a mark, faint but undeniable. A streak of something dark, like soot or ash, smeared across the inside of his wrist. It wasn't a bruise, wasn't dirt. No matter how much he rubbed at it, it wouldn't fade. His mother's lips pressed into a thin line. She exhaled through her nose, murmuring something under her breath. Another prayer, another plea. She reached for a small wooden bowl on the table, dipping her fingers into the cool water inside. Without a word, she pressed her damp fingers against the mark. The scent of herbs, rosemary, rue, something sharp and bitter, rose between them. The mark remained. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled away. "You need to be careful," she said, her voice quieter now, more urgent. "It's watching you." Sebastián met her gaze. She wasn't afraid, she was worried. There was a difference. "Has it watched before?" he asked. His mother's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted. A shadow of memory, a flicker of something she wouldn't say. Finally, she reached for the candle, pinching the flame out between her fingers. "Yes," she said. Sebastián's pulse thudded in his ears. He thought of the shadow, the way it had just stood there, watching, waiting, and he realized something. It hadn't come out of nowhere. It had always been there, waiting for him to notice. Chapter 4. The Crying in the Closet. By 20, Sebastián had learned to keep his abilities to himself. He had known since childhood that others did not hear what he heard, did not see what he saw. He had learned through punishment, first by his father's heavy hand, then by the whispered prayers of his grandmother, who feared his gift was a curse. "Pretend you do not hear," she would tell him. "The dead are jealous of the living." But pretending was not always easy. After leaving home, Sebastián wandered for a while, taking work where he could find it. Eventually, he was hired at a finca, an old sugarcane plantation owned by Don Rafael and Doña Sofia. The estate was enormous, its once grand house weathered by time and neglect. Vines curled along its cracked walls, and the shutters, long in need of repair, clattered in the wind. Sebastián's duties were simple: mend the fences, tend the livestock, clean the storage rooms. The work was honest, and Don Rafael, though distant, was fair. But there was one rule: never enter the second-floor bedroom. No explanation, no warning, just the rule, spoken firmly and without room for argument. At first, Sebastián did not question it. The house had an air of secrets like many old places. But then the crying started. At first, he dismissed it. The house was large, and old houses made strange noises, wood settling, wind whistling through cracks. But this was different. A baby's cry. Soft, muffled, almost pitiful. It came from behind the locked door. For weeks, Sebastián ignored it. He busied himself with work, rising before dawn and collapsing into bed after sundown, exhausted. But exhaustion did nothing to silence the cries. Each night, as the house fell into stillness, the sound returned. It did not wail, did not scream, only wept. A delicate, sorrowful sob that curled into Sebastián's chest like a sickness. The other workers never spoke of it. They went about their business with bowed heads, their faces tight with silent knowledge. But Sebastián could not look away. Each time he climbed the stairs, the sound seemed louder, pressing against the walls, vibrating in the air. He tried knocking once, lightly, as if that might calm whatever lay beyond. The crying stopped for one breath. Then it resumed, harder, like a child's desperate plea. That night, Sebastián dreamed of small hands clutching at his shirt, of tiny fingers curling around his own. When he awoke, he could still feel them, phantom touches brushing against his skin. That was the night he decided to open the door. He found the key in the study, tucked behind a cabinet filled with old books and ledgers. It was heavy, its brass worn smooth from time. The second-floor hallway was darker than usual that night, as though the house itself was holding its breath. The candle in Sebastián's hand flickered violently, sending twisted shadows dancing along the walls. The crying was louder now, more urgent. He slid the key into the lock. Click. The door groaned open. Dust filled his lungs. The air inside was thick and stale, carrying the scent of old wood and forgotten things. It was not a bedroom. It was a storage space, filled with covered furniture, dust-coated boxes, and a heavy, forgotten desk against the far wall. Cobwebs hung in thick strands from the ceiling, catching in the candlelight like fragile silk. No crib, no baby. Yet the crying continued. A whisper-soft sound, weaving through the stillness, drawing him forward. It was coming from the closet. Sebastián hesitated. His pulse pounded against his ribs. The door was slightly ajar. The smell hit him first. Damp wood, mildew, and something else. Something sour. His fingers trembled as he reached for the handle. The wood was cold, almost damp. With a deep breath, he pulled it open. Darkness. The candle's flame barely touched the corners of the closet. But the crying was louder, vibrating against the walls, filling the small space like a storm trapped in a bottle. His foot brushed against something. He knelt, reaching blindly into the shadows. His fingers brushed against something smooth and round. He pulled it into the light. A glass mayo jar. The lid was rusted, its glass cloudy with grime. Something inside moved. Sebastián's breath turned to ice in his chest. The candlelight caught something within the jar, a flash of pale, shriveled skin, the faintest trace of bone beneath. His stomach lurched. He dropped the jar. It hit the floor with a dull thud, rolling slightly before coming to a stop. The crying stopped. The silence was worse. The weight of realization pressed against Sebastián, sinking into his bones. There was no living child. There never had been. The next morning, Sebastián took the jar to Don Rafael. The old man was on the porch, as always, sipping his aguardiente. The golden liquid trembled in his glass as he saw what Sebastián carried. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Don Rafael exhaled, his shoulders sinking beneath an unseen weight. "It wasn't me," he murmured. Sebastián waited. The old man's fingers curled around his drink. His voice, when he spoke again, was quieter. "My wife," he said, "years ago. She had an affair." Sebastián's grip tightened around the jar. Don Rafael's eyes were distant, locked on something only he could see. When she found out she was pregnant, she ended it before anyone could know. The words settled between them, thick and suffocating. Sebastián swallowed. "She killed the child." A muscle twitched in Don Rafael's jaw. She was afraid. Sebastián stared at him, disbelief curdling into something bitter. Fear did not excuse murder. The jar felt impossibly heavy in his hands. "Why keep it?" Sebastián asked. His voice was barely a whisper. Don Rafael did not answer. He didn't have to. Sebastián understood now. Some secrets were never meant to be unearthed, but the dead did not cry for no reason. They cried when they had been forgotten, and Sebastián had heard, even from beyond the grave. Chapter 5. The Landslide and the Running Dead. Sebastián's visions weren't always about the dead. Sometimes they were about the dying. He had dreamed of the landslide before it happened. The vision had come to him in a rush of suffocating darkness, the earth groaning beneath a relentless downpour. He saw houses clinging desperately to the hillside, their foundations trembling, giving way like brittle bones snapping under weight. The sky cracked open with thunder, and then came the rumble, a deep guttural sound that swallowed everything. He heard screams. They were silenced too quickly. Sebastián woke up gasping, the taste of soil thick in his mouth, as if he had been buried alive. His heart pounded against his ribs like a desperate fist against a coffin lid. He didn't need anyone to tell him it wasn't just a dream. He warned whoever would listen. The mayor dismissed him with a wave of his hand, muttering something about superstition and unfounded panic. The priest told him to pray. Some neighbors listened, but most shook their heads. He was the boy who saw things people didn't want to believe in. And then, 2 nights later, the rains came. It started as a whisper, a gentle patter against rooftops, the kind of rain that lulled people to sleep. But Sebastián sat awake, listening. He knew better. He could feel it deep in his bones, an ache that had nothing to do with illness and everything to do with the oncoming storm. By dawn, the river had swelled to a monstrous, writhing thing, its waters clawing hungrily at the land. The earth, soaked beyond its limit, began to slip. Trees groaned, roots snapping like tendons torn from muscle. And then came the landslide, a tidal wave of mud and stone and ruin. The world tilted. Houses crumbled, streets disappeared beneath a tide of devastation. People ran. Some screamed. Others never got the chance. Sebastián stood on the farthest hill, watching helplessly as the town was swallowed whole. His breath was shallow, his hands clenched into fists. He had seen this. He had seen all of this, and yet knowing had changed nothing. 500 souls were lost beneath the mud. The funeral. A week later, the town held a mass funeral in the gymnasium. The gym smelled of incense, thick and cloying, burning in bronze holders near the makeshift altar. Wilting flowers lined the walls, their petals curling at the edges, their scent sickly sweet in the stagnant air. The heat pressed in from all sides. Fans whirred overhead, their dull hum lost beneath the murmurs of the grieving. The pews, borrowed from the church, were filled with families draped in black, their faces hollowed by loss. Mothers clutched damp tissues, fathers sat rigid, their grief a silent, suffocating thing. Sebastián stood near the entrance, his hands clammy, his throat dry. He had been to funerals before, but nothing like this. Rows upon rows of closed coffins, each draped in white cloth. Names pinned to the lids, handwritten in shaky script. Gone, all of them gone. He felt the air shift behind him, a brush of movement too quick to be the heavy steps of the mourners. Someone rushed past him, a man in a white tank top, a number pinned to his chest. Sebastián turned sharply. "Oi!" The man didn't stop. He was running. Not just moving, running. His bare feet slapped against the polished gym floor, his breath ragged, his body tense with urgency. He weaved through the crowd unnoticed. No one turned. No one gasped in surprise. Sebastián's pulse quickened. He spun to a nearby group of mourners. "Did you see that guy?" They looked at him, confusion knitting their brows. "What guy?" one of them asked. Sebastián's blood ran cold. His gaze snapped back to the figure, only to see the man disappear between the rows of coffins. He moved without thinking, his body following instinct before logic could catch up. He pushed through the crowd, past the sobbing families, past the priests murmuring prayers. The scent of wax and wilted roses thickened in his nostrils. And then he saw him, the man in the tank top. Only this time he wasn't running, he was lying in a coffin. Sebastián's breath hitched. He stepped closer, the weight in his chest pressing harder with each movement. The number on the man's chest was still there, slightly crumpled, pinned to the front of his sweat-stained tank top. His face was slack in death, eyes closed, lips slightly parted as if he had just taken his final breath. "Señor Martinez." Sebastián staggered back, his stomach twisting violently, his head spun, a cold sweat breaking along his forehead. No, he had just seen him. Running. Alive. Hadn't he? A tremor passed through him, something deeper than fear, something raw and suffocating. He wanted to believe it was exhaustion, that maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. But then the air shifted again. A whisper of movement. Sebastián turned, his pulse hammering against his skull. And that's when he saw them. Not just one, not just Martinez. Dozens. People weaving between the coffins, people who shouldn't be there, people who were already dead. Some walked, some ran. Others simply stood, their faces turned toward the living, their eyes blank and unseeing. Their movements were sluggish, like marionettes held by invisible strings, swaying with the breath of something unseen. Sebastián's throat tightened. He wanted to scream, but the dead don't listen. They only run. Chapter 6. The Weight of Knowing. By the time Sebastián turned 25, he had learned the burden of knowing too much. The living feared him, the dead sought him, and the future whispered in his ear whether he wanted it to or not. He carried their secrets like stones in his pockets, each one pressing against his ribs, a quiet suffocation he could never escape. He could no longer be just another man in his town. He was Sebastián Vélez, the boy who saw beyond. The streets of Utuado had not changed in the years since he was a child. Dust curling in the air from passing carts, the scent of roasting maize mixing with the damp musk of the river, old stone buildings standing stubbornly against time. But he had changed. When he walked through the market square, vendors no longer called to him. Their eyes flicked away, some tracing the mark on his palm, others pretending not to notice him at all. He could hear their hushed voices, the way they spoke his name in reverence and fear. He knows things he shouldn't. The dead follow him. They say he doesn't sleep because of what he sees in the dark. He did not deny these things. He could feel the cold breath of the spirits that trailed behind him, hear the soft murmurs of things that no longer belonged in this world. Their presence had once terrified him. Now they were simply a part of his existence. On his best days, he convinced himself that his gift was a calling, not a curse. On his worst, he longed to be ordinary, to not see the shadows that clung to the edges of reality like cobwebs no one else could perceive. Yet, ordinary men did not wake to the sound of voices that belonged to the long buried. Ordinary men did not dream of things that had not yet come to pass. It had begun, as many things did, with a single death. When Sebastián was 9, his grandmother died in the middle of the night. He remembered the stillness of the house, the way the air felt thicker, as if grief itself had weight. The scent of her lavender perfume lingered in the room long after her body was taken away. And then, on the 7th night, she came back. He had been lying in bed when he felt a presence by his door. He turned his head, expecting his mother, but it was not her. It was Abuela. She stood in the doorway, her white nightgown whispering against the floor, her dark eyes looking into his with something both familiar and foreign. "Mi niño," she said softly, her voice carrying the same warmth it always had. But there was something else beneath it, something Sebastián did not have words for. He could not speak, he could not move, he could only see. Her lips curved into a gentle smile, but her eyes held knowledge she had not possessed in life. "Do not be afraid." And then she was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of lavender and the knowledge that nothing in his life would ever be the same. The visions came in flashes, never gentle, never with warning. A fisherman's wife clutching Sebastián's hands, pleading to know if her husband would return from the sea. The answer bursting into his mind, no, before he could stop it. A child, lost in the hills, his mother sobbing at Sebastián's doorstep, and the image that came unbidden, the boy's small body beneath a jagged rock, the wind singing lullabies through the trees above him. A man, his breath heavy with drink, demanding to know if his brother's death had been an accident. Sebastián's throat burned as the truth forced itself from his lips. He was pushed. They all came to him, and he answered. But knowing the truth did not always bring peace. More often than not, it brought something far heavier. He had seen too much. He had felt too much. And in the quiet moments, when the world was still and the weight of his knowledge pressed into his chest, he wished he could silence it all. But the dead did not rest, the visions did not stop, so neither could he, the stories we carry. Some say knowing the truth sets you free. Sebastián Vélez knew better. The truth was a chain, and he carried it alone. Walks the line between the living and the dead, bearing the burden of their stories, because someone has to. And if you listen closely, if you watch the spaces where the light doesn't quite reach, you might just see him too. Some see the dead. He sees what they leave behind.
Every story has an end, but here, the mysteries never stop. Thank you for watching and being a part of this journey into the unknown. Your support keeps these stories alive, and there's plenty more waiting for you. We drop 3 new stories every week, so if you crave suspense, the unexplained and the downright chilling, make sure you're subscribed and ready for what's next. Until then, keep your lights on, your doors locked, and remember, some stories stay with you long after they're told.